And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
To Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into the part 3 of the Papalia crime family. And last week we talked about Johnny Papalia moving into the narcotics rackets, but before he could totally get his feet wet and his hands wet, as it were, he would do a few dry runs. With that working out, as we said, permission was granted by Stefano Magaddino. And before they could expand nationally and internationally, there were two big infamous meetings which needed to be called. The first meeting was a Luciano-based meeting in Italy, as Luciano wanted to expand the drug routes. Narcotics had always been a staple of the mob, but as vast and as large as that operation would become, you might suspect it would be the little intangible details that might stifle them, but rather is more of a simplistic one. Prior to the French connection, the mob had basically to rely on different way stations, as most of the opium that they were using was coming from Afghanistan at the time. This was before the Golden Triangle. The process was arduous, and they truly needed a middle ground where they could manufacture and not totally rely on Afghanistan. But the truth is, had they might have never been eventually caught by the French authorities. So we've talked about Cuba in the past. And the one thing that I kind of have sort of neglected to say in some ways is to talk about the real reason why Cuba was the destination of choice by the mob. Its proximity to the United States was obviously one factor. The fact that they could essentially control the government was another. All the gambling, making sort of Cuba a mecca for the high life, was more of an example of the mafia using what was around them to make even more money. Cuba had been used before, and the entire Caribbean, for rum running that went all the way back to the pirate days. And we know that Joe Kennedy and others used Cuba and the Caribbean for those actions, but we're not going to twist the legacy here. Cuba was mainly a destination for drugs, okay? They wanted something closer to the United States for importation. They wanted Cuba to be the middle ground for narcotics, and I suspect at some point manufacturing might have probably been on the table for Luciano in Cuba. I think, relatively speaking, and keep in mind, I'm not a narcotics expert by any stretch of the imagination. However, I don't know the ins and outs of all of that, but what I can tell you is this much. Moving the product can be difficult today, right? They still get away with it, obviously, but it's difficult. Back then, it wasn't nearly as difficult. It was the manufacturing process, which is what the mafia wanted to control. Waiting for Afghanistan to ship it was just a long process for them, and then finding the people that could refine it was a whole entire another matter for the mob. Now, granted, Italy at that time was manufacturing, but everything, in the life of the mob is always about cutting costs and maximizing profits. Luciano had been exiled in Italy, had, no desire about retiring as far as narcotics went. He not only wanted to bring Sicilian gangsters in, but he wanted to combine the American mafia with the Sicilian mafia. And with Marseille, France being involved in the operation, they just needed a way to organize all of it together to make it work. Now, Luciano would call a meeting at the Grand Hotel de Palms in Palermo, Sicily. Now, keep in mind, prior to this, he met with both Vic Catroni and Johnny Papalia in Naples to discuss the French operation. That meeting would allegedly take place between October 12th through the 16th in Palermo. Now, people have incorrectly described this meeting in many different ways. They've described the meeting where, the Bonanos were introduced to the heroin trade. But the reality is the Bonanos and the Profacis and the Genovese crime family were already sort of involved in different operations, but very similar, just not to the epic scale that was about to begin. Also, I want to make sure that everybody understands that there was not really a French connection, as those assertions have been made since the 1950s. There was not really a hierarchical structure in the French connection, but rather rival clans of Corsican backgrounds or Sicilian backgrounds who just for a time got along together because it was business. There would be spillover, there would be arguments, there would be vendettas, there would be murders, but they sort of kept it together for the sake of money for the most part. So this idea that they were one big unit and functioning like one big machine really isn't the case. Like I said, the small little clans were involved and everybody just kind of worked together because it was good for business. As we said last week, or I think 2 weeks ago, with Ndrangheta, they were clannish, same thing in this particular instance. So for instance, the Guarinis, who were mentioned in the French mob family list, actually weren't even involved in the trafficking. But believe it or not, and this is what's interesting, they were essentially just a front family for the whole entire operation. They needed a family that could be blamed for it if that were the case. And so much like we talk about in this country, front bosses, the Guarinis were a front family. Okay. So yeah, even back then they used front families to cover their operations, specifically, like I just said, the Guarinis, and their main job was to keep the peace. And they balance things out with other groups, say in terms of sort of acting like a consigliere, okay? In fact, if you look close at a 1960 report on the connection, on the French connection, the Guarinis aren't even mentioned. Meanwhile, 4 other families are: the Venturis, the Marangianis, the Patrizis, and the Mandolinis, and the Aranzi brothers, whose organization by that time was already defunct. So there's a lot of mistruths and a lot of misexamples of the French connection over the years. So we know the Venturis had contacts in Montreal and organized there. The Mondoloni crime family set up bases in Mexico and Latin America, just to show you how they expanded. So the idea that the French connection was a worldwide juggernaut, they really at best were mainly the link of the chain of a lot of people. They were just a link in the chain. But truth be told, without them, Luciano would never be able to exploit those drug routes to begin with. To say it simply, the French connection were basically subcontractors to organized crime. Nothing more, nothing less. And that's not to take anything away from, them. But if you think about it, Luciano was pretty astute here because he used everybody to do all the legwork while the Mafia collected the majority of the proceeds. Through contacts, they established a heroin base in Beirut, Lebanon, which then would be cooked and made into heroin in Marseille and then shipped to Italy, Canada, and the United States. Once it hit American shores, the drugs were divided into 28 Mafia families. So 28 mob families all got a piece of the action depending on their location. So Luciano ends up holding a meeting. Those in attendance were Lucky Luciano, Joe Bonanno, Carmine Galante, John Bonaventure, Frank Garofalo, Johnny Papalia, Santos Sorge, John DeBella, Vito Vitali, Gaspare Magadino, Salvatore Greco, Joe Genco Russo, Salvatore Greco II, who was a cousin, Vincenzo Rimi, Filippo Rimi, Angelo Lo Barbara, Gaetano Badalamenti, Toto Minore, Tommaso Buscetta, Calcedonio Di Pisa, Cesar Manzella, Rosario Mancino, and Giacchino Panino. These are a lot of different names, but they're all familiar names because we've talked about narcotics in the past. So none of those names should be unfamiliar to you. So Luciano's sole goal here is to put Sicilians in control of the transportation of the narcotics. He wanted them to control every aspect of the distribution. It basically simply meant that they had deals in place in the Mideast to ship to Italy. From Italy, it would head to France for production. Then Marseille would handle the manufacturing, and then it would be redirected to Italy for moving. At the time, Sicilians were not active in totality within the drug trade. They were involved, but they weren't involved in like an epic scale, much like the Corsicans, how the Corsicans kept a lot of the drug dealing just to the island. And it really wasn't until the 1970s where they said, fuck this, and they got involved in a massive scale. So with Luciano moving to put them into business, it offered Lucky Luciano a lot of control and a lot more power. Now, because I believe in being transparent, a lot of people have speculated that this meeting never ever took place. The problem is, all those names on the list were, you can correspond the names on the list being in Italy on those dates. So from a confirmation standpoint, you cannot deny that they weren't there. Mobster turned informant Tommaso Buscetta refused to admit or acknowledge that there was actually ever a meeting. But Joe Bonanno, in his shit-filled book, mentioned being there on those dates, but didn't confirm who he met. But it all sort of leads to what is about to happen in Canada, especially with Carmine Galante being sent there. So there are FBI 302s which detail Salvatore Bonanno acknowledging that his father did attend meetings in Sicily about narcotics. So, I mean, me personally, I believe that the meeting took place. There is also Italian police reports, which I do have, about all of these men being seen together at different restaurants during this time period. The Italian authorities had been following Luciano since he arrived back in Italy. So there's all these reports, but these reports were not found for decades, and they were found buried in a police filing cabinet in Palermo, but a copy was sent to the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in D.C. 8 years after those events. So to say that it didn't happen is laughable, but if you're looking for an informant to step forward and say, yes, I was there, this is what we discussed, no, you're not going to get that. But for anybody to say it's completely not true, you just got to do a little research. Besides, if you cross-reference the 1965 indictments to all those names, more than half are included in that indictment. So there's some relativity here, okay? So at this meeting, Luciano basically sets up the routes, explains that what he basically wants, and just basically dotted his I's and crossed his T. He ends up placing Joe Bonanno in charge of Canada, which then by proxy allowed Carmine Galante to go and sort of head that up. It's also at this meeting that Galante gets permission from Luciano to import zips from Italy to help out his affairs in Canada. It was also at this meeting that Cuba and what Genovese did to Luciano ends up getting brought up. This was obviously prior to Genovese's move against Costello, but Luciano was still pissed. And an open discussion was brought up on basically about what to do about Vito Genovese. Otherwise, I think Vito Genovese would have been at that meeting. But it's at this meeting that it was decided that they were going to set Vito Genovese up for a narcotics pinch that we know that ultimately Genovese would get hammered for. It's been alleged at this meeting Luciano put $100,000 on the table to pay towards using someone to frame Vito Genovese down the line. The funny part is Luciano should have moved quicker because what's about to happen to Costello and the next meeting is going to create a lot of problems. So while for the most part, it was all systems go, albeit on the narcotics front, the second meeting, which we're not going to rehash, comes just after Genovese makes a move on Frank Costello and makes a move with Carlo Gambino on Albert Anastasia. That meeting we know is the Appalachian Conference. We've spoken at length about this meeting in particular and the purposes for it. And it was basically the arrival of King Lear, Vito Genovese. What is interesting is that Genovese, like I said earlier, was not included in the Palermo meetings. One of the topics at Appalachian was Cuba and how the Mafia was going to use Cuba as a center for drugs. And some ideas about manufacturing there, I'm sure, were brought up. And that was met with a lot of eyebrow raises because Luciano had already pretty much worked out a system. So what you do is what you're seeing here is Genovese sort of trying to put his impetus into this. And it was sort of Genovese attempting to flex in front of other mob bosses, but that was met with scoffs from Santo Trafficante, he was the main guy who was just kind of like, nope, Luciano's got this set up. We're just going to leave that alone. So, I get a lot of questions all the time about who was at that meeting. So we're going to go through all the names. In Northeast Pennsylvania, there was Joe Barbara, who was the host, Russell Buffalino, Dominic Alamo, Angelo Sciandra, Ignatius Canone, Anthony Guarini, James Ostico, Pasquale Turagano, Manny Zaccari, Salvatore Travellino, Patsy Sciartino, Patsy Monachino, Guy Pasquale, Mo Modugno, Bartolo Guccia. From the Bonanos, John Bonaventure, Anthony Riella, and Joe Diamonds Evola. From the Genovese crime family, Vito Genovese, Jerry Catania, and Mike Miranda, and Salvatore Chiri. From the Gambinos, there was Carlo Gambino, Joe Riccobono, Paul Castellano, Carmine Lombardozzi, and Tommy Rava. From the Lucchese's, Vinnie Rao, John Ormento, and Joe Rosado. The Rosado brothers, the Rosados. From the Profacis, there was Joe Magliacco, Salvatore Tornabe, and Joe Profaci. From the DeCavalcantes, there was Frank Maggiore and Willie Larasso. From the Buffalo crime family, there was John Montana, Nino Magadino. That's a great name. Nino Magadino. Sounds like a porn name. Roy Carlisi, Jimmy DeLuca, Sammy Laguda, and Dominic D'Agostino. From Utica, the Falcone crime family, Joe Falcone, Salvatore Falcone, and Rosario Mancuso. From Rochester, there was Costenza Valenti and Frank Valenti. Excuse me. From Pittsburgh, there was Mike Genovese, John LaRocca, and Kelly Manarino. From Philadelphia, Joe Ida and Dominic Oliveto. From Cleveland, John Scalish and John DeMarco. From the Patriarcha crime family, there was Frank Cucciara. From Springfield, Illinois, Frank Zito. From Springfield, Massachusetts, Salvatore Cufari. From the Trafficante crime family, Santo Trafficante Jr. From Dallas, Joe Civello and John Coletti. From Colorado, Jimmy Coletti. From Los Angeles, Frank DeSimone and Simone Scazzari. From Kansas City, Nick Civella and Joe Filardo. So, we know what went down at this meeting. We know why it happened. But this meeting really fucked up the mob because it was for the first time the mob couldn't hide anymore. While J. Edgar Hoover had pretty much buried them as much as he could, this was something he just couldn't let go. This is something he could no longer hide. It became world news on every newspaper. So for the first time in history, the government had to acknowledge that the mafia existed. Why a slew of people weren't killed as a result of this kind of blows my fucking mind. Why in the hell Genovese had it at the same fucking place blows my mind. Why Genovese was never killed for that, I'm never going to understand. But for some reason, Joe Barbara and Stefano Magadino got blamed for the whole entire thing, which is why Chicago tried to kill Magadino twice. But I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, it was Genovese who signed off on it. So he probably should have been sort of held accountable for that. Could have saved the mob a lot of headaches down the road. But anyway, moving right along. So everything's in place. Back in Canada, Carmine Galante was positioning himself in a way that started to sort of stoke some problems. While Luciano signed off on Bonanno being the American Mafia representative in Canada, especially with narcotics, what Galante begins to do is poach into other areas which didn't belong to the Bonanno crime family. Remember, Papalia had worked for Galante at one point, but after his ascension as boss in Hamilton and his induction into the Buffalo mob crime family, there wasn't a whole lot he could do about Carmine Galante because he was reminded by Stefano Magadino, be a help, not a hindrance to other bosses and groups in the area. The problem was Galante was expanding into everyone's turf without a fucking care in the world. Now, I'm sure that there were probably some discussions, albeit internally, about whether Bonanno was behind that move or whether Galante just sort of went fucking nuts or rogue, because being in Canada made him one of the more powerful guys and a seriously dangerous fucking guy, too. If there were any thoughts about killing Carmine Galante, I'm sure that they were cut off quick. And that's because of Luciano's wanting the Bonannos there. And by proxy, it was almost essentially giving his blessing to Galante being there. And nobody wanted to piss off Luciano, and nobody wanted to screw with the narcotics operations. However, I'm going to offer you an idea or an outside-the-box sort of logline with this. And here's my question. and I'm curious to what all of you think. I often wonder why Luciano would even give Joe Bonanno a chance in Canada, considering he didn't trust him as far as he could throw him. And I also wonder, in part, of sending him to Canada if he was hoping on some sort of level that someone would make a move on him. I almost wonder if that's why he did it. Now, surely he had to know that Stefano Magaddino was irate with Bonanno. He had to know there was a beef and vice versa, because I'm sure he got reports back to, reports came back to Luciano about Galante going apeshit in Canada. And think about what he does. He allows Galante to be put in the middle of Canada where he knows Galante is going to start doing things he shouldn't do. And it's worth noting that Galante would eventually be tossed out of Canada because of his overexpansion. And it's widely been said that somebody 100% dropped a dime on Carmine Galante. Now, the question would be, who did? Who did that? Well, it wouldn't have come from Joe Bonanno. And Bonanno had solidified his friendship with the Catronis because he inducted Vic Catroni into the Bonanno crime family, making him a captain within that crime family. And what that was, that move right there, that was a tit-for-tat sort of reflex because Johnny Papalia had been inducted into the Buffalo crime family. So in other words, Papalia becomes a boss of Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, right? And to solidify his prowess, he's inducted into the Buffalo crime family, which gives Buffalo a right to act, right? So now you have a guy that's basically a boss of his own area, supporting other small fringe bosses. He's a made guy in an American crime family, so Joe Bonanno does basically the same goddamn thing with Vic Catroni. He basically says, okay, you run your little certain area in Canada, so I'm going to induct you and make you a captain into my crime family. And all this is an example of doing is a tit-for-tat move. Okay, so you're going to put Johnny Pops in? All right, watch what I'm about to do. So at every step, Magaddino and Bonanno are kind of matching each other. And it goes back to, at some point, Luciano had to know that allowing Bonanno to do this is going to create friction. And maybe he does this intentionally because he knows Bonanno's sort of acumen. He knows Bonanno's a greedy fucking guy. And he has to realize at some point that's going to create friction. And I think this was Luciano's way of controlling Bonanno's destiny. That's just what I've always believed. And I believe that Luciano was a crude thinker like that. He was very shrewd and crude. But I have a theory on a lot of this. So, there would be a lot of enemies, okay? And then that list would be long because of Galante's desire to control not just Montreal, but all of fucking Canada. And like I said, I have a theory on who dropped a dime, and that would have been Vic Catroni or somebody from the Catroni crime family, because when Galante begins to pilfer all the extortion rackets in Montreal, the Catronis are the ones who suffered that financial loss the most. They would have been the ones who were pissed. Now you can go, and I'm going to probably misquote it, but something like fucking, $50-60 million the Bonannos were pulling out of Canada a year. Granted, Galante didn't last that long, but the person that would have wanted Galante out of there more than anybody would have been Vic Catroni, because he was overexpanding, creating problems. He was killing fucking people. They were losing a ton of fucking money. That money would have been Vic Catroni's. Even at worst, he has to split it with somebody else. So that's $30 million a year. The fact Bonannos weren't even giving him 10% of that tells you something. They were using Catroni to overtake what technically was his area. It's all more convincing to me when you consider that not a few years later, Bonanno would totally dump the Catronis and back the Rizzutos, which is very odd, because we're going to find out when we cover the Catronis and the Rizzutos, they went to war. So the fact that they kind of switched and backed somebody else should tell you everything about the Bonanno psychology. It's money. And granted, the Rizzutos really didn't become real total powerhouses till the late 60s, but still, they slowly began to rise up, and Bonanno would back them instead of the Catronis. And like I said, we know the Rizzutos and the Catronis would end up going to war. But it's just food for thought more than anything. But I cannot see Luciano not foreseeing that being a problem. But they were handled when Galante is tossed out of his ass in 1958 out of Canada. So, as Johnny Papalia returned to Canada, it was pretty much business as usual. He kept expanding into the and trafficking was off to a great start. In Toronto, Papalia wanted to expand deeper into the protection rackets, and he fixated on independent gangsters who had no representation or backing. So in other words, if they had money, he wanted it, and he would get it, or else. It was the price of doing business. So Papalia would move full force into sports betting at this point. He wouldn't just take over. He would just take over any operation that he felt like taking over. And if anybody got in his way, they suffered horribly for it. Papalia would then move into the vending machine business and would use Arthur Tartaglia as his front man in that operation. And he would call that operation Monarch Vending Machines. Anyone who didn't have a machine would have no choice. And if they refused, their building would be torched or the owners would be beaten senseless. They would also establish Star Vending Machine Company with the same motivations. That company, Papalia would put Ernest Kutnik in charge. Not long after, a wide string of warehouse robberies would begin, and tons of cigarettes were stolen and somehow ended up in the Monarch vending machines and the Star vending machines. 40,000 cartons of cigarettes were stolen within 8 months from different warehouses. Papalia then moved into bingo halls, and this is one of the more interesting things I found when doing all my research for this. There's a company by the name of Esquire Novelty, and they had begun selling bingo cards to churches and halls. Now, not only did Papalia buy these halls, but he overtook the fucking industry. The Lions Club in Sudbury, Ontario was charging $250 per 1,000 cards. And $250 per 1,000 cards, and controlled the lion's share of the card selling industry. Now, Esquire salesmen who were sent to rival bingo halls were selling 1,000 cards for $1. So it wasn't $250, $2.50 per 1,000 cards. So what Papalia does is he sends salesmen out to sell cards for $1. And the reason why he does that is it's cheaper, and he's going to sell more cards, which means, guess what? He's going to overtake the card selling industry, which means he's going to put other bingo halls out of business, because if they don't get on board and they can't get cards, guess what? They've got nothing. They can't do nothing. And what they would do is they would sell these cards just before the games began out front, demolishing the profits for rival bingo halls. It wasn't just that, but Papalia had an ingenious scam going on. They brought in a card press operator for their rival bingo halls. They would have a guy fly in who had a printing press that was small enough to hide in a purse. So as the numbers are being called, this jackoff is sitting there hitting these numbers on this little printing press. And so basically what happens is they could ensure that the 5 or 6 people that they planted in the bingo hall would win. Okay. And they would take $13,500 a night from these rival bingo halls. And they did this everywhere. And they did it to put out rival businesses. They wanted to get rid of any rivals. So Papalia took a 50% kickback from those profits. And it's estimated, okay, and this is just one racket, it's estimated he pulled in just $6 million a year just on that racket alone. Ton of fucking money. Then Papalia begins to move into robberies. He would establish business with other mob families, and would string of robberies would begin, mainly stolen bonds. Montreal and Toronto would then sell back the stolen bonds at insane rates, and that went on year after year without interruption. Now, Max Bluestein. Max Bluestein was a guy who ran floating craps games at hotels at night. And it was an incredible racket. While the Mafia had similar things that were going on, Bluestein had 4 of the biggest events, and it went on twice a day. Bluestein was one of those guys who just refused to let the Mafia in his pockets. He didn't give a shit. Papalia wanted a cut from that action, and what Papalia really wanted was a cut from the Lakeview Athletic Club, which was pulling in $13 million a year in these high card stakes poker games. And the owner of the Lakeview Athletic Club was Max Bluestein. So Papalia, it kind of floated some things out there. And basically he was offered to host his own card game in the athletic club. And he does it, and it ends up getting raided. Keep in mind, Bluestein had been doing this for years and it never got raided. But the one time Papalia does it and it gets raided, immediately Papalia smells a rat and he blames Bluestein for it, thinking that he called the cops on his own fucking club to try to fuck Papalia. Papalia was beyond fucking angry at this. He wanted to crack Bluestein, but Bluestein actually ends up going to jail on some other stuff. And here's what's interesting. When Bluestein is arrested, it was for like failing to pay tax. There was a $1,500 fine, and Bluestein was a multimillionaire. So Bluestein had the option of paying a $1,500 fine or sit in jail till you do. And what does he do? He sits in jail for 4 months rather than pay the fine because he knew that Papalia was looking for him. And he knew that Papalia knew that he likely had something to do with the club getting raided. So Papalia, once finding out that Bluestein's in jail, goes over to the club and he tells Chiavarini, who was a gambler in the club, was kind of running it at the time, that I'm taking this over and that a percentage is coming back my way. You have no choice. Chiavarini gets a little started and he runs over to the jail to go see Bluestein, who then decides after 4 months to pay the fine to bail himself, to get himself out. Then there's a meeting that is set up where Papalia is going to talk to Bluestein. Bluestein was absolutely not going to take any of Papalia's shit, which was, as you're going to find out, one of the biggest mistakes he ever makes. So the meeting is set. Bluestein heads to downtown Toronto to the Town Tavern. Okay. He would be flanked by a couple of different guys, Gabbery and Weaver, who were two guys that pretty much looked after Bluestein and protected him. Papalia was seated nearby with his goons, Marchildon and Irwin, and they were both psychopaths. So Papalia sends over a drink, and that symbolizes a lot of things to Sicilians, okay? First of all, if you send a drink, it's out of respect. Second of all, it's something out of business relationship. And what Papalia was known to do was to go down and send a drink over. And that was code for, we're now in business together. And if you accept that drink and you drink it, that means we're in business. We don't have to have any words. I can leave and I know we have an agreement. Okay, that's just the way that Papalia did things. So he sends it over. And if Bluestein accepts the drink, it means they're now partners, and then Papalia could get up and walk away. Now, Bluestein knows that if he accepts that drink, he's fucked. And rather than be civil, he grabs a waiter's attention. Yeah, come on over here. He explains he doesn't want the drink, and he says, go to the guy who sent it and tell him he's a fucking punk. And if he wants to talk, he needs to get off his fucking ass and come over here and see me, not the other way around. It's a pretty stupid fucking thing to say. And then Bluestein finishes that up by saying, I don't get up for anybody. So the waiter goes over, he approaches Papalia and he begins to whisper in his ear. And Papalia just kind of smirks and nods his head. And he didn't budge. He didn't frown. He didn't grimace. He didn't budge an inch. This, unfortunately, for whatever reason, made Bluestein feel confident that he had told Papalia what the fuck to do. And he wasn't worried, but he should have been. So he tells his two henchmen, go ahead and go. I can handle these punks. They're soft. They're not going to do shit. Another huge fucking mistake. Couple hours go by, and eventually Bluestein noticed that Papalia and his friends were gone. As the bar begins to shut down sometime around 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning, Bluestein is going to make his way to the hat check. As he's standing there, he feels something coming up behind him, and he turns around and he pulls out a thin-bladed fish knife. The next thing he knew, he was hit on the head with a blackjack, and he falls onto the floor. Marchildon then begins stabbing Bluestein in the back and would stab him 8 times. The next thing that happens is iron bars and pipes were then being swung by Marchildon, Irwin, and Papalia. They connected on his legs, his arms, his head. And the funny part is these pipes and bars, they weren't holding. They were attached to ropes. So these motherfuckers could swing these things at 100 miles an hour over and over again. They then begin to pipe him in the face. At some point, one of them began punching Bluestein in the face with brass knuckles. brass knuckles caving in his eye sockets, his orbital bones, and cheekbones. His whole face was fucking fractured. As Bluestein laid there, blood pouring out of his back and his face, Papalia broke a bottle and jammed it into Bluestein's mouth, cutting the inside of his mouth so bad you could see through his cheeks into his mouth. Then, for good measure, Papalia stomps on his face. The insane part about this whole entire event is that people that were outside of the bar could see what was going on inside of the bar, and they called the police. Papalia and his goons would take off on foot, leaving Bluestein dying on the floor. The problem for Papalia was that the beating, like I just said, took place in plain sight, and dozens saw what happened. It was actually hundreds, but Papalia would end up going into hiding after the fact. But friends would tell Papalia that the mob was taking heat because of what he did, and he needed to turn himself, as police had issued warrants for his arrest. Excuse me. Now, witnesses who saw what happened would receive sudden, strange phone calls in the middle of the night about forgetting what they saw, and that it would be better for their health if they forgot what they saw. Of 100 witnesses, not a single fucking one was willing to testify. Charges would be brought anyway, and Papalia eventually would turn himself in. As he did turn himself in, he showed up at the Toronto police station, and as he does, there are journalists and newspaper people standing outside waiting for him, and he begins to scream at them that they were fucking low-life rats and creeps. As a result, Papalia would be found guilty and sentenced to 18 months in prison. The funny thing, though, all the witnesses that were called didn't seem to remember anything about the beating. Decades later, Papalia would say that he had no regrets about almost killing Bluestein, remarking that Bluestein was a rich, greedy prick who didn't do the right thing, so he got what was coming. Bluestein was never the same, and even though he did manage to hold on to whatever rackets he had left, he sort of became a nutcase. He would later be put into a mental institution. He was so fucking crazy. So in 1961, when Papalia gets out of the jail, he would build his new headquarters, which would become, as we mentioned earlier, Monarch Vending Company. It was located off 20 Railroad Street. Papalia would then establish Galaxy Vending Machine Company and formed a monopoly on the vending machine business. According to tax records, Monarch Vending made $12,000 a day. Papalia would then move into hijacking to boost cigarettes to fill his vending machines, which complemented his robberies to fill them. He then would move into the pinball machine companies through a company by FM Amusements, which also included Beer Magic, which then became a monopoly on beer dispensers. As his loan sharking operations began to expand, he would charge over 1,000% on loans. And so, in other words, they had to pay $6 back on every $5 borrowed. So if guys got too deep with Papalia, they had really not many options. They would either take out another loan, get their legs broken, their house taken from them, or Papalia would force them to take his vending machines, especially if they owned businesses where he thought these vending machines would do well. If that didn't work, he would just break them in half without a second thought. And yet, you don't hear anybody talking about this guy ever. Guy's a fucking mastermind and a violent prick. So, in the background of all of that, drugs were moving at a serious pace, but there would be a huge, crucial mistake. In September of 1960, the Sicilian wing of the narcotics operation makes a huge fucking mistake. Sicilian mobsters shipped a trunk of heroin to the wrong address in New York. Papalia finds out. He flies to New York. He sits down with Vincent Morrow, who was handling the American side of the trafficking through the Genovese crime family. He's basically the guy that Papalia had used before when they did the dry runs. He spoke about the mistake, and he also explains why this could never happen again. Papalia would leave, but then he would stop through Buffalo on his way home to see Stefano Magaddino, who had recently suffered a heart attack. In the interim, Freddie Randaccio was in control of the day-to-day operations of the Buffalo crime family, and they discussed the issue in Sicily. Randaccio explains to Papalia, send Vito Agissi to Sicily to explain the birds and the bees to them. So in other words, one more mistake like this, and you're going to be killed. Bottom line. The problem was it was a little too late. What had happened was agents had arrested 2 Sicilians who were in possession of 2 trunks filled with 10 kilos of heroin. It was a $70,000 loss for the mob. As the 2 Sicilians were interrogated, someone talked, and they linked the drugs right back to Toronto and Johnny Papalia. The American agents would actually head to Toronto, and they would sit down with the Toronto police, and in their investigation would find a telegram which detailed someone trying to ascertain the whereabouts of the trunk. Toronto Police Chief James Mackey put his best 12 men on the case. What they would find out was that dozens of Italian Canadians had made trips back and forth to Italy, and it was paid for by Alberto Egisi. The next step was to involve the French authorities, the Italian authorities, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And informants, Salvatore Rinaldo and Matteo Palmieri, gave it all up. They would uncover the Egisi role in the drugs. They would uncover a lot, and they would uncover a lot, and very quickly. A lot of guys had been sloppy. From May to June of 1961, 45 would be arrested. Joe Palmieri was arrested in Sicily. Vincent Morrow would be arrested in New York. Frank Caruso, Salvatore Maneri would be arrested here in New York. In Toronto, Alberto and Vito Egisi would be arrested. And towards the tail end of 1961, Johnny Papalia would be arrested and charged with narcotics trafficking. Now, Genovese, who at the time, Vito, was in prison in Atlanta, had warned his men to stay the fuck away from drugs. But Anthony Bendestralo didn't, and Genovese would order his death from prison cell. Vinnie Morrow would eventually absorb and take over all of Stralo's rackets. Now, Morrow, Caruso, and Maneri would end up getting bail, but then what they would do is jump bail using passports provided by Canadian gangsters and lawyers. They would head to the Bahamas, then they would go to Spain. Once they reached Barcelona, they would be met by a middleman for Lucky Luciano, who handed them enough cash to keep them moving. They would eventually be caught and rearrested. They all had fake IDs with fake names from Canada, which connected them to Cosa Nostra, unfortunately. Egisi got out, but was furious, and he was furious at Stefano Magaddino, who had promised to look out for them, but suddenly didn't give 2 fucks about the Egisi's problems. Magaddino had been collecting extra money every month for them for years for defense funds, for going on the lam funds, bail funds, lawyer fees, and etc. Very similar to what Joe Profaci did. But Magaddino just didn't give a fuck. He pocketed the fucking money. So what ends up happening is Egisi ends up having to sell his car and his house just to make bail. And he's fucking furious, and he has every right to be. And he's so furious that he demands a meeting with Stefano Magaddino. Bad decision. Real bad decision. Because he would never be seen alive again. His body would be found on the side of the road in Rochester, New York, and he had been tortured. His mouth was literally broken in half. 8 teeth were laying nearby. 3 ribs were shattered. His ankles and wrists were bound by nylon. Fresh strangulation marks were buried deep into his neck. His windpipe had been shattered. He was soaked in gasoline, and his body apparently had been lit on fire several different times. According to reports, he was tortured for a week straight. Not a bright move. So in July of 1961, Johnny Papalia would be extradited to the United States to face charges. It was a pretty open and shut case, and in April of 1962, he would plead guilty and be sentenced to 10 years in prison. He would naturally try to appeal, but would lose that appeal. So with Papalia off to prison, Stefano Magaddino would replace Papalia with Santos Scabetta as the new boss in Hamilton. In 1963 in Italy, Papalia would be charged with narcotics trafficking and gangsterism and be found guilty in absentia and would be sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, those charges really don't matter as long as Papalia never went back to Italy. This is one of the things that we see Italy do all the time. That's a large reason why he never, ever went back to Italy. Now, what is interesting is at one point, when he did get out of prison, Italy attempted to have him extradited to Italy, but the Canadian government refused to do that, stating that Papalia was a Canadian citizen and that gangsterism laws were not valid in Canada. Therefore, they were shit out of luck. So Papalia would spend his time at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, and he would be released in 1968. While Papalia was away, like I said, Santos Cabello and Giacomo Luppino of the Luppino crime family, this is before the Luppinos established their family, they answered to Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo. So when Papalia gets out, he's a little pissed because, basically all of his side hustles are gone. And basically, Magaddino had taken all of Papalia's rackets that he established on his own, and he gives them to Paul Volpe, who was another member of the Buffalo crime family in Toronto. Infuriated by this, Papalia goes to see Luppino about the return of his rackets or his interests in Toronto, and Luppino says, "You're shit out of luck." We've heard that before. I'm not going to get into specifics, but there's a case, not a case, but there's something that happened in the early 2000s that's very similar to this. And that creates a lot of friction and a lot of goddamn problems. And it's going to present some problems because Papalia is pissed. And he has a reason to be. He went to jail. He did his time. Everything that he established, from his vending companies to everything else, was stolen from him by Paul Volpe, which is, it's not only going to infuriate Papalia with Magaddino, but it's going to infuriate Papalia when it comes to Giacomo Luppino and Santos Cabetta. So the question becomes, is Papalia going to be able to reestablish himself? Is Papalia going to be able to become the powerhouse again, or is it going to get Papalia killed? And I think you kind of already know the answer to this one and what's kind of going to happen to him. But it's an interesting look at organized crime. So next week when we come back for part 4, things are going to get a little more interesting as Luppino ends up taking over and Papalia really begins to struggle to gain back his foothold. And that's going to be his undoing. It's an interesting juxtaposition in the life, because if you go back to the first episode when, Papalia takes over for his father and he kind of makes inroads with other people and begins to build his own kind of fucking thing. And Magaddino, recognizes it in him and has him made into their family so that they can bridge the gap from Buffalo to Canada. And then he does all of these things. And then he does side hustle for Carmen Galante because, he's a tough guy and he doesn't fuck around. And then he's, pretty much told to be the mob boss in Hamilton that's just good to everybody else. And if you really think about it, he's being used at every turn by everybody because he's powerful. But he's as powerful alone as he would be with Magaddino. He would have been better to align himself with Joe Bonanno, because that would have been a true fucking powerhouse. You imagine if he aligned totally with the Bonannos and he had Galante and him there at the same time? Holy shit. But once again, it's a systematic sort of oxymoron to a lot of degrees, because we see this in organized crime all the time. The money is what makes the machine go. Guys are happy as long as they're getting money. But Papalia goes away. Magaddino has to do something, so he puts other people in charge. Now, did he do the right thing by not giving the guy his rackets back? No. I would have given them right back, because he's the one that established those. It's the right thing to do. Tell Volpe to go fuck himself and and start his own fucking racket. But that's the problem. When Papalia gets out, he really has no choice but to fucking take it. Because if he presses too hard, the end. So it's amazing that Magaddino used him at every turn to get stature, to get money, to get turf, to get territory, to get respect. And at the end, is he going to give that back? No. And that's maybe more of an inclination of why Joe Bonanno couldn't fucking stand him. Because maybe Joe Bonanno knew what Stefano Magaddino was truly made of. Now, granted, Joe Bonanno had his own problems. And Joe Bonanno, by his own dealings, was sort of a shifty fuck. But, nobody ever said that Carlo Gambino was a scumbag for being as shrewd as he was. So maybe Joe Bonanno was a little more shrewd and kind of realized internally what Stefano Magaddino was all about. And so maybe that's why he just kind of said, okay, well, let's just watch this and see how it goes. So maybe in the end, Bonanno had a reason to feel the way he did. Oftentimes they've tried to blame, Bonanno trying to kill Magaddino, but I don't suspect that to be the case. That was an outfit move, and there were reasons for that. And that really went back to Appalachian. Everybody blamed him for that. But then what's sort of interesting when you really look at it in the totality of it all is that nobody ever tried to kill Joe Bonanno, and I can't seem to figure that out. I cannot seem to. One, he ran and took off all the time. But if you really break it down, if Joe Bonanno never gets shelved, okay, and he remains a powerhouse, that guy outlived everybody. He would have been like what exactly he wanted to be, which was the boss of bosses. But here's the thing. He couldn't have done that from Arizona. And that's my thing, because a lot of people will say, well, if he had just sat back and just played ball, eventually he would have been the last surviving one. But I don't think that would have been the case, because he would have been nailed on the fucking commission case. He would have been fucking nailed on the concrete case. He wouldn't have been able to escape that. So we can play the wheel of odds, but I don't think Joe Bonanno would have been able to survive in New York. I'm just being honest with you. So once again, we're going to come back next week for another episode of the Papalia Crime Family. I hope you guys are getting something out of this Canadian series. And one of the things I never see, and I'm not doing it to toot my own fucking horn, but I never see anybody talking about Canada or these guys, because Papalia is like Carlo Gambino of Canada. Vic Catroni, same thing. Vito Rizzuto. I mean, and the list just goes on and on and on. But nobody covers them. And it's not like the information is hidden in a fucking vault in the bottom of the Suez Canal. I mean, this is information that you have to really look hard for. And that's why it took me so long to get into this series, because a lot of stuff in the background for months was just looking at research, calling people I know in Toronto and Laval and talking to them to get their opinion of it. And that's the thing. When I talk to other people in other countries about this stuff, I'm not looking for inside information. I'm looking to pick their brain, especially if they're in the 70s and their 80s and they were around in those times. They can give me sort of the political climate of organized crime. Because I'm never looking for inside information, but I'm looking for the climate. Because somebody who lived through it, somebody that was connected to it, who may not be connected anymore. In some cases, I know people who are. But to understand the climate of what was going on, they can give me an honest sort of look at it. And they all have. And that's why I talk to people in Europe. That's why, and in Canada, because they tend to be less egotistical about it and more sort of, look what I persevered through. This was the climate in 1961. This is why shit was so crazy. I can't believe I lived through this. I'm lucky because there was a lot of this. There was a lot of that. You're not going to get that from an author, because authors weren't there. They can tell you third, fourth, fifth-hand stories, but I'm getting it from people who lived it. And that's the difference between what I do and what other people do. That's why I still enjoy doing this. And every once in a while I get real lucky and I come across something that nobody's ever seen before. And I'm like, holy shit, how come nobody's ever talked about this? It's luck of the draw, I guess. But if you're not going to do research, you can't. I mean, Christ, this Papalia, we've done what, 2, 4, 6 hours or give or take or whatever, just on Johnny Papalia and how he even got there. And you can see how bright the guy was, violent as shit, but how bright he was. Once again, I go back to these guys could run Fortune 500 companies, but who wants to work for it? You know what I mean? So I'm enjoying the fuck out of doing this series. And listen, I don't want anybody sniping my ideas, but I just wish that mob content people would stop saying, well, everybody does the same thing. We don't. We absolutely don't. Go on YouTube. Look for a whole entire 5 family series. You're not going to see it. You're not going to find it. Look for a whole entire Canada series. You're not going to find it. You're just not, because nobody does it. And I think a lot of it is laziness. People don't want to do the research. But I enjoy it because I learn more. A lot of people say I'm a walking encyclopedia. I didn't get that way by luck. It takes work. So, that's going to be it for this week. But before we go, if you guys don't have any plans tonight at 9 o'clock, we're going to do Mob Talk Radio Live over on over on YouTube. In the meantime, I wish all of you a very, very Merry Christmas. I know this time of year isn't easy for everybody, but if you get bored and you need some encouragement, you can reach out to the show. Mob mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com. Or if you have my number, you can send me a text. There are so many of you that I would like to mention by name and just say Merry Christmas. And I almost don't want to say anybody's name because I just don't want people, oh, you didn't mention me, we're friends. So there's like Rob, there's Marie, there's Kat, there's Mariah, there's Stevie, there's Sonny. Rob, I think I said Rob. There's Ollie in Finland. There are so many people. But I just, Chris Gorky of all people. So there's so many that I could, personally wish. Gordon, my pal Gordon. I love Gordon. So many of you. And all of you make this show what it is. You make it fun to do. You make it a special thing to do. And without all of you, the show really wouldn't matter. Because like I say, and the difference between me and a lot of people is I'm educating you. I'm teaching you. That's what I enjoy. I don't know if people get a picture of me, being 600 pounds or something, eating pasta, going, hey, ho, hey, ho, ho. My life isn't like that. I don't necessarily like the more grisly side of organized crime, but I got to admit, whacking a horse and throwing him off a cliff's pretty funny to me. So anyway, I want you guys to have a beautiful Christmas. If you're getting snow, enjoy it. Here in New York, it's raining cats and fucking dogs, which, truth be told, I'd rather have snow than fucking rain. Rain's miserable, especially you're wearing jeans and the bottom end of your jeans get wet and you're walking down the street. You can